Fourth International, The Establishment of the Fourth International, by Robert J. Alexander. The founding conference of the Fourth International was finally held on September 3, 1938. Meeting under highly secretive circumstances, a handful of men proclaimed the existence of what they proudly proclaimed to be the World Party of the Socialist Revolution. Working at what must have been a marathon pace, this founding conference, completing all of its works in a single day, also adopted statutes for the new group, elected its officials, and adopted a wide range of resolutions in addition to ratifying the so-called transitional program, which became the most fundamental statement of the position of international Trotskyism. The background of the founding conference. The historical circumstances of the conference. The meeting which formally established the Fourth International took place at the height of the Munich crisis, at a moment when the threat of a new world war seemed imminent. The Trotskyists had to take extreme security measures to assure the safe fulfillment of their mission. They had to protect themselves not only from the possible interference by the French police, but more importantly from attempts of the Soviet GPU to disrupt the meeting and perhaps to kill some or all of those attending it. In the months preceding the founding conference, the GPU had claimed several victims from among the Trotskyists and their sympathizers. Erwin Wolf had been kidnapped and murdered in Spain. Ignaz Reis, himself a GPU agent who had defected to the Trotskyists, was assassinated in Switzerland. Leon Sadov, Trotsky's own son, had died in a white Russian hospital in Paris in February 1938 under very strange circumstances. Most relevant to the founding conference, Rudolf Clement, the member of the International Secretariat who had been most closely concerned with organizing the meeting, had been murdered in Paris in July, and documents which he had been carrying were purloined. After the meeting adjourned, it was announced that the founding conference of the Fourth International had been held, quote, somewhere in Switzerland, end quote. In fact, however, the meeting took place at the home of Alfred Rosmer, who, although he had broken politically with him 8 years before, had remained Trotsky's personal friend and was willing to make his residence available for the meeting which fulfilled Trotsky's long-held dream. The Rosmer house was located in the countryside some 30 miles from Paris. It was a barn which had been converted into a residence. There was an entryway, and beyond it a long table around which the meeting was held. Beyond that there were the living quarters, including a kitchen and dining rooms and several upstairs bedrooms. Those who attended the meeting sought to be as circumspect as possible about where they were going and what they were going to do. Thus they took a number of different routes from Paris to the Rosmer house, although they all had to traverse the same road in the end. Because of security considerations, it was necessary that the meeting not last more than a day. As a consequence, a great deal of business had to be transacted in a very short time, even though over some issues there was considerable discussion and even controversy. The situation was further complicated by the fact that there was no common language which all of those present could understand and use. As a consequence, Max Shachtman served as a kind of universal interpreter. He spoke not only English, but good German and French, and a little Polish and Russian. He also spoke Yiddish, which he used particularly in conversing with the Russian and Polish delegates when his mastery of their languages was not sufficient. Thus, the role of the American leader was particularly crucial in facilitating the business of the day. Preparations for the conference. Rudolf Prager has noted that the founding conference of the Fourth International, quote, was undoubtedly better prepared than the previous ones, end quote. The laying of the groundwork for the meeting was done in close thought I had water, and then I didn't. And I panicked. Anyway, Rudolf Prager has noted that the founding conference of the Fourth International, quote, was undoubtedly better prepared than the previous ones, end quote. The laying of the groundwork for the meeting was done in close consultation with Trotsky. In March 1938, a delegation from the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States consisted of James Cannon, Rose Karsner, Max Shachtman, and Vincent Dune had spent 6 days with Trotsky, during which much of the preliminary planning for the meeting was done. Diego Rivera also sat in on some of these sessions. At that time, it was decided to hold the conference at the end of June or the beginning of July, although in fact it did not meet until 2 months later. It has been noted that much of this week of discussion was devoted to, quote, programmatic documents to be prepared for the conference, end quote. Stenographic notes were kept of these discussions. There has been some controversy over just what role Trotsky had in preparing the fundamental documents which were adopted by the founding conference. In his discussions with the Socialist Workers' Party visitors, Trotsky had said that, quote, I will prepare then, 1, transitional demands, 2, the question of democracy, 3, war, 4, manifesto on the world situation, either separately or in the form of one basic pamphlet, end quote. In his biography of Trotsky, Isaac Deutscher wrote that, quote, throughout the summer of 1938, Trotsky was busy preparing the, quote, draft program, end quote, and resolutions for the, quote, Foundation Congress, end quote, of the International, end quote. However, Will Reisner has claimed that Deutscher, quote, was mistaken in attributing authorship of most of the conference resolutions to Trotsky, who actually wrote only the major programmatic document, The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International. Also known as the, quote, transitional program, end quote. Subsequent to the visit of the SW Peers to Mexico City, commissions were established which met for about a month before the plenary session of the founding conference, preparing the documentation to be submitted to the meeting. According to the report of the International Secretariat on the conference, quote, the plenary sessions have been prepared with the collaboration and under the direction of the International Secretariat by particular commissions which submitted the results of their work to the conference. The plenary meetings were themselves followed by meetings of special commissions established for complementary work of editing and revision. These commissions, designated by the conference, were only to carry out the wishes of the conference, end quote. Other preliminary meetings were held before the final plenary meeting of the founding conference. The most important of these was a, quote, pre-conference in New York of Trotskyist groups of the Western Hemisphere. It established a Pan-American and Pacific Bureau of the soon-to-be-proclaimed Fourth International. As a consequence of this preliminary work, the founding conference was presented with a well-thought-out agenda and the documentation necessary for the discussion of each item on it. The agenda consisted of 1. Report of the International Secretariat, 2. International theses divisible into 3 sections, labor questions, the USSR, the war problem, including the situations in Spain and China, 3. Statutes of the International. 4. Reports of commissions dealing with the situation of affiliates in various countries. 5. International solidarity. 6. The youth. And 7. Naming the International Executive Committee. Delegates and whom they represented. According to a credentials report made at the beginning of the meeting by Pierre Neville, there were delegates at the founding conference from the United States, Great Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Poland, Greece, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Brazil. He added that some of those present also had, quote, mandates, end quote, from groups in Spain, Czechoslovakia, Canada, and Mexico. According to a report on the founding conference published shortly afterward by the New York Trotskyist paper Socialist Appeal, 30 people attended the meeting. The minutes of the session would seem to indicate a somewhat smaller number taking an active part. On the most important issue on which there was a vote, whether or not to declare the establishment of the Fourth International, only 22 ballots were cast. The same number voted on several other issues. Trotsky, of course, did not attend. However, a number of the most important figures then active in international Trotskyism did participate. The delegation from the United States included James Cannon, Max Shachtman, who presided over the sessions, Nathan Gold, and Emmanuel Geltman. Pierre Neville, Ivan Crépieux, Jean Rousse, and Marcel Heek represented France. Mario Pedrosa, the founder of Brazilian Trotskyism, represented his country. Michel Raptis, better known as Michel Pablo, was present from the Greek movement. Leon Lesoil was a delegate from Belgium, and C.L.R. James was a member of the British delegation. Pierre Neville presented the meeting with an account of the organizations then, quote, regularly affiliated, end quote, with the Fourth International. These were France, Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste, and Jeunesse Socialiste Révolutionnaire. Great Britain, Revolutionary Socialist League. Belgium, Parti Socialiste Révolutionnaire, and Jeunesse Socialiste Révolutionnaire. Germany, German Communist Internationalists, the IKD. Poland, Bolshevik Leninist Group. United States, Socialist Workers' Party and Young People's Socialist League, Fourth International. Canada, Bolshevik Leninist Group. Spain, Bolshevik Leninist Group of Spain. Netherlands, Bolshevik Leninist Group. Greece, International Communist League and Internationalist Communist Union. Switzerland, Marxiste Action. Czechoslovakia, Iskra Banner Group. Norway, Bolshevik Leninist Group. Romania, Bolshevik Leninist Group. Austria, Revolutionary Communist. USSR, Left Opposition, Bolshevik Leninist. Mexico, Liga Comunista Internacionalista. Cuba, Partido Obrero Revolucionario. Dominican Republic, Bolshevik Leninist. Brazil, Partido Operario Leninista. Argentina, Bolshevik Leninist Group. Chile, Partido Obrero Revolucionario. Bolivia, Bolshevik Leninist Group. Uruguay, Bolshevik Leninist Group. China, International Communist League Indochina, Union of Bolshevik Leninists. Australia, Labour Party. South Africa, Bolshevik Leninist Group. Neville has also noted that there were two other groups which had, quote, liaison with the IS without being affiliated, end quote. These were the Proletar Group in Czechoslovakia and an unnamed organization in Denmark. At one point, Pierre Neville presented the conference with some estimates concerning the membership of the various affiliated national groups. According to him, the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party was by far the largest group in the International. He credited it with 2,500 members. The Belgian party had 800 members, the French 600, the Polish 350. Neville reported that there were approximately 200 members of the German affiliate, between 150 to 200 in the Czechoslovakian group, and 170 in the newly united British affiliate, the Revolutionary Socialist League. The international affiliates in Greece, Chile, Cuba, and South Africa were each credited with about 100 members, that of Canada with 75, and the Australian, Dutch, and Brazilian with about 50. Finally, Neville reported that there were from 10 to 30 members of the Spanish affiliate and 16 in that of Mexico. I just want to look up something real quick. How do you spell this guy's name? Pronounce this guy's name.
Pierre Naville.
Naville. Right. It's weird because I'm trying to, in English, I can have like an sound. It seems like a lot of languages it's an E sound, so I think I was pronouncing it right. Pierre Naville. Instead of Neville. Neville reported that there were from 20 to 30 members of the Spanish affiliate and 16 in that of Mexico. Isaac Deutscher has raised some questions about the supposed size of the various national groups represented at the September 1938 conference. He cited figures which appeared in an SWP internal bulletin of the period claiming a membership of only 1,000, and he noted that Dwight MacDonald claimed that in his memoirs that the Socialist Workers' Party had only about 800 members. In any case, it is clear that the new international which was being brought into existence was by no means yet a, quote, mass organization, end quote. Issues and resolutions. The question of founding the international. The small size of the organization sparked what was apparently one of the 2 or 3 most warmly debated issues at the founding conference, as it had been within some of the organizations which were represented there. That issue was whether or not to proclaim at the meeting the formal existence of the Fourth International. Although the vote was overwhelmingly in favor of the action, it nonetheless had been a question which had been hotly debated before and which was strongly argued at the meeting itself. Trotsky was strongly in favor of the September 1938 meeting, going on record as establishing the Fourth International, the World Party of the Socialist Revolution. In his discussions with the Socialist Workers' Party leaders 6 months earlier, he had made this very clear, quote, I agree that it is absolutely naive to postpone. Naturally, we are a weak international, but we are an international. This international will become strong by their own action, not by maneuvers of other groups. Naturally, we can attract other intermediary groups, but that would be incidental. The general line is our own development. We have no reason to boast that we are strong, but we are what we are, end quote. In the months preceding the founding conference, one of the strongest opponents of the proclamation of the Fourth International had been George Verakin. Verakin. I don't know how to say it. Let's see. That's
Georges Verakin. Georges Verakin.
Georges Verakin. Verakin. One of the principal leaders of Belgian Trotskyism. He had written that, quote, in our opinion, the objective and subjective conditions necessary to take that historic step do not yet exist. Our international organization does not yet have profound and solid roots in the international proletariat. We have only feeble groups which for the most part are separated from the working masses, end quote. Verakin asked the question, quote, what are the conditions which would permit taking this supreme act, end quote, and answered it, quote, For an international to be created, to live, to develop, and to become the historic instrument of the proletariat, it is necessary that it come from and be the product of the proletariat, and above all of the struggles against capitalism and its servants. But our international organization is far from that. It only consists of militants thrown out of the Second and principally the Third International. It is not a direct product of the struggles between capital and labor, but in great part the product of the struggle of tendencies within the old degenerated workers' organizations, not a direct product of social struggles, but an indirect product, end quote. Verreiken was out of the movement by the time of the founding conference. There, the principal opponents of founding the International were the members of the Polish delegation. Subsequently, Isaac Deutscher, who was not present at the meeting, claimed that he had been the author of the statements of the Polish delegates against founding the International at the September 1938 meeting. Karl Hertzmendel, one of the two Polish delegates, first opposed the proclamation of the Fourth International. He was reported as saying that, quote, one cannot discuss the question of the Fourth apart from the situation of the labor movement. The labor movement is passing through a period of disintegration and depression in the fascist countries. In the democratic countries, the Stalinist pressure is making the workers retreat, end quote. Hertzmendel went on to say that, quote, the Third was created after the victory of the Russian Revolution, and with a great number of communist parties already formed, even though the Simmerwaldian left was stronger in 1919 than we are today, the Spartakists were against the proclamation of the Third International. We don't have numerous organizations. The organizations have no mass influence, above all in the unions, end quote. The Polish delegates concluded that, quote, the future of all humanity depends on the Fourth International. One cannot create a fiction, but only a true international. It is the proletariat which will create the Fourth International. It is necessary to enlighten the workers and prepare the movement. If we remain a propaganda group, the workers will not demand much of us. But if we are an international, the workers will demand leadership, and we are not able to lead. They will be disillusioned. So long as the Fourth has no mass parties, it cannot be proclaimed, end quote. A number of delegates replied to the Polish arguments, notably Pierre Neville and Max Schachmann. According to the minutes of the meeting, Neville argued, the historical analogies put forward by Karl were all false. There was no analogy whatever between the Fourth and other internationals as regards the appropriate moment for their proclamation. The present was a unique political situation which fully justified the creation of the Fourth. The real question was not whether to proclaim the Fourth, but whether the existing national sections really needed a definite international organization. The answer to this question was that, in fact, it was absolutely necessary for the national sections to have a clearly delimited international organization, whatever size it might be. It was essential to put an end to the present indeterminate situation and to have a definite program, a definite international leadership, and definite national sections, end quote. Neville. Max Schachmann also argued against Hertzmendel's historical analogies. He noted, according to the minutes of the meeting, that, quote, as for the Third, Lenin posed the question long before the Russian Revolution. He did not bring the proposal up at Simmerwald because he hoped to win over various vacillating and centrist groups. It was the same consideration which prevented us from proclaiming the Fourth in 1936. It was still hoped to gain the centrist organizations. Since 1936, however, all the centrist organizations have either disintegrated or evolved away from us. The path is thus clear for the proclamation of the Fourth, and it is necessary to constitute it definitely, end quote. Max Schachmann. When the vote was finally taken, the motion to declare the Fourth International in existence was passed 19-3. Only the French delegate Crépeau voted with the two poles, implementing the decision to proclaim the Fourth International. The debate and vote on the proclamation of the existence of the new international was actually part of the discussion of the statutes of the organization. The vote on this general issue was also 19 in favor, with the same 3 delegates voting against the statutes. The statutes of the Fourth International were a relatively short document of only 13 numbered articles. Article 1 proclaimed the name of the organization to be Fourth International, World Party of the Socialist Revolution. Article 4 proclaimed that, quote, the internal structure of the international on the local, national, and world scales is determined by principles and practice of democratic centralism. The sections are required to observe the decisions and resolutions of the International Conference, and, in its absence, of the International Executive Committee represented during the intervals between its meetings by the International Secretariat, while nevertheless retaining the right of appeal before the next high bodies until the next International Conference, end quote. The statutes provided that the International Conference should be held every 2 years, and the International Executive Committee of 15 members should meet at least every 3 months. There was also provision for subsecretariats to be set up in various parts of the world to work under the general direction of the International Secretariat. Sections were empowered to recall any of their members serving on the International Executive Committee with the approval of a majority of the IEC members. It was provided that there could only be one section in one country. Mergers of such sections with other groups seeking to enter the International had to have the approval of the IEC. All national sections were required to pay regular monthly or quarterly dues to the International. Article 13 provided that, quote, the IEC has the right, after examination of and consultation with the interested parties, to pronounce the expulsion of sections or individual members of the Fourth International. Decisions of expulsion are executory, although the interested parties retain the right of appeal before the International Conference, end quote. The founding conference also elected the first International Executive Committee. Its members were J. Roos, Pierre Neville, and Joanne Bardeen Beutel of France, James P. Cannon, Max Shachtman, and one additional member to be named by the Political Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States. Leon Lesoil and Walter Dog of Belgium, CLR James and Denzil Harbour from Great Britain, Julian from Italy, Karl Hertzmendel from Poland, Mario Pedrosa of Brazil, Tu Tao of Indochina, and Leon Trotsky as a, quote, secret member, end quote. There was also to be a youth representative to be named by a youth conference, which was supposed to be held in the near future. The vote on these names was unanimous. Another organizational matter consisted of a series of resolutions concerning the internal situations of several of the affiliates of the International. One of these congratulated the British comrades on having achieved unity in a single organization. Another ordered the immediate unification of the 2 Greek organizations represented at the conference. A resolution on the situation in Poland ordered the Trotskyists there to withdraw from the Jewish Labor Bund and form a separate organization. Another called for the reorganization of the Mexican section and condemned the policies of those who had hitherto been leading it. Still another noted reunification of the Canadian section and directed it to continue work within the Canadian Commonwealth Federation, that country's second international affiliate. Finally, a particularly harsh resolution condemned the, quote, present state of disorganization, end quote, in the French section, and laid down lines for the reorientation of its activities. This was supplemented by a resolution endorsing the decision of the French Trotskyists to exclude Raymond Molinier from their ranks. One second. Another organizational question dealt with by the conference was the establishment of organizations complementary to the Fourth International itself. One of those resolutions noted the extensive persecution of, quote, revolutionists, end quote, by bourgeois and Stalinist organizations and governments, and called for establishment of national, quote, relief and defense organizations, end quote, by the various sections, and the formation of an international committee to coordinate their work. Another resolution, ostensibly issued by the, quote, International Conference of the Youth of the Fourth International, Lucerne, Switzerland, called for the rallying of youth around the new international and put forth a series of demands for adequate opportunities for work, non-discriminatory social legislation, and expansion of educational facilities. The Sino-Japanese and American resolutions. The founding conference of the Fourth International adopted 3 programmatic resolutions. By far the most significant and long-lasting of these was the so-called Transitional Program. However, the 2 other, on the Sino-Japanese War and the thesis on the world role of American imperialism, were also important reflections of Trotskyist thinking at the time of the formal establishment of the Fourth International. The resolution on the, quote, war in the Far East and the revolutionary perspectives, end quote, started out by proclaiming that the conflict between China and Japan, quote, assumes the character of a war of liberation, end quote. Most of the 20-page document consisted of analysis of the role of the ruling classes of Japan, China, Great Britain, France, and the United States in the struggle, as well as that of the Soviet regime and of the Chinese Communist Party. The resolution reviewed the old condemnation by the Trotskyists of the policies of Stalin during the 1926-27 civil war in China and extended that condemnation to include the supposed, quote, surrender, end quote, of the Chinese Communists with Stalin's backing in the period of Chiang Kai-shek's domination of China. The last 2 numbered paragraphs of the resolution, numbers 31 and 32, then spelled out the attitude to be adopted toward the conflict then raging. The first of these proclaimed that, quote, having discovered in experience the utter bankruptcy and impotence of the Comintern, the national bourgeoisie and their Stalinist allies, the Chinese masses will more and more incline to rely on their own organizations and their own arms. They will look to the Bolshevik-Leninists for leadership and rally under the revolutionary standards of the Fourth International, end quote. This turn of events will presage a vast revolutionary upheaval encompassing not only China, but Japan and the Japanese colonies. Finally, paragraph 32 proclaimed, quote, the perspectives outlined above obligate the workers in all countries, and especially in the revolutionary vanguard, to support China's struggle against Japan by all possible means. The defeat of Japanese imperialism will not only open roads to the revolution in China and Japan, but will encourage fresh waves of revolt in all the colonies of the imperialist powers. It will, moreover, remove a grave menace to the Soviet Union and stimulate the Soviet proletariat to struggle against the counter-revolutionary Stalin regime. The international revolutionary campaign for aid to China must proceed under the banner of workers' sanctions against Japan and find its full expression in the promotion of the class struggle and the proletarian revolution. The position of the United States in the world, end quote. The position of the United States in the world at that time was considered as sufficient. considered of sufficient importance to be worth a separate resolution. That document started by pointing out that the United States, although working everywhere to expand its imperialist influence, operated differently in Latin America, Europe, and the Far East. In Latin America, the resolution argued the United States had been increasingly dominant since the turn of the 20th century. Using the Monroe Doctrine, it had fought against the influence particularly of the formerly dominant British and more recently against growing penetration by Germany and Japan. The Roosevelt administration, the resolution argued, quote, despite all its bland pretensions, has made no real alteration in the imperialist tradition of its predecessors. The, quote, good neighbor, end quote, policy is nothing but the attempt to unify the Western Hemisphere under the hegemony of Washington as a solid bloc wielded by the latter in its drive to close the door of the two American continents to all the foreign imperialist powers except itself, end quote. In its relationship to Europe since the First World War, the United States had passed through three phases. In the first, quote, it appeared as a brutal aggressor in defense of the vast financial interest acquired by the American ruling class in the outcome of the war and by virtue of its tremendous industrial, financial, military power. It contributed the decisive force required by the Allies for the crushing and prostrating of the Central Powers, especially Germany, end quote. Then, quote, in the second stage, inaugurated by the defeat of the German proletariat at the end of 1933, the United States appeared at once as the, quote, pacifier, end quote, of Europe and as the greatest counter-revolutionary force, end quote. It demanded the disarmament of Europe so that the Europeans would have the resources available to repay their war debts to the United States. Finally, quote, in the present last stage of its intervention, end quote, the United States, quote, far from eliminating or even moderating the conflicts among the European powers themselves, end quote, has caused, quote, an enormous aggravation of the inter-European conflicts of the various powers. All of them are being driven irresistibly towards a new world war, some in defense of their present share of the rations to which America's power has reduced Europe. Others in struggle for such an increase in their share as will contribute substantially towards resolving their internal contradictions, end quote. Insofar as the Far East is concerned, the United States, as a late participant in the struggle for power and influence, had favored the, quote, open door, end quote, particularly insofar as the exploitation of China was concerned. The resolution saw the principal rival of the United States in the Asian area as still being Great Britain, although for the time being it supported British resistance to the militant imperialism of Japan. However, quote, the question of the war between Japan and the United States for the domination of the Pacific and the Far East is at the top of the order of the day. Fearing the outcome of a war with the United States at the present moment, Japan has been making desperate efforts to placate the United States and drive a wedge between the United States and England, at least until her position on the mainland has been consolidated, end quote. From this analysis, the resolution concluded that, quote, the struggle against American imperialism is therefore at the same time a struggle against the coming imperialist war and for the liberation of the oppressed colonial and semi-colonial peoples. Hence, it is inseparable from the class struggle of the American proletariat against the ruling bourgeoisie and cannot be conducted apart from it, end quote. The founding conference resolution proclaimed that the Fourth International was, quote, for the immediate and unconditional independence of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, the Philippine Islands, Hawaii, Samoa, and all the other direct colonies, the dependencies and protectorates of American imperialism. It concluded by instructing its Latin American section to develop closer association with the U.S. section and the struggle in the United States for revolutionary change, and advised the United States section to pay more attention through its press, demonstrations, and other means to the struggle of the workers of the country subjected to U.S. imperialism, and particularly to carry out propaganda and organizational work among people from those countries living in the United States. The Transitional Program. By far the most important programmatic document passed by the founding conference of the Fourth International was the long resolution entitled, quote, "The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International," end quote, more popularly known as, quote, Transitional Program, end quote, which had been drawn up by Trotsky himself. This document became the most fundamental statement of the position of international Trotskyism. The perspective from which the transitional program was written was that the world revolution was imminent and that the Fourth International would, quote, inevitably, end quote, lead that process. It started off with the statement that, quote, "the world political situation as a whole is chiefly characterized by a historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat," end quote. It then went on to claim that, quote, "the economic prerequisite for the proletarian revolution has already in general achieved the highest point of fruition that can be reached under capitalism," end quote. Trotsky further reiterated that point, quote, "all talk to the effect that historical conditions have not yet, quote, ripened, end quote, for socialism is the product of ignorance or conscious deception. The objective prerequisites for the proletarian revolution have not only, quote, ripened, end quote, they have begun to get somewhat rotten. Without a socialist revolution in the next historical period at that, a catastrophe threatens the whole culture of mankind. The turn is now to the proletariat, i.e. chiefly to the revolutionary leadership," end quote. Trotsky then set forth his concept of a, quote, transitional, end quote, program for the revolutionary epoch. He wrote that, quote, "the strategic task of the next period, a pre-revolutionary period of agitation, propaganda, and organization, consists in overcoming the contradiction between the maturity of the objective revolutionary conditions and the immaturity of the proletariat and its vanguard. It is necessary to help the masses in the process of the daily struggle to find the bridge between present demands and the socialist program of the revolution. This bridge should include a system of transitional demands stemming from today's conditions and from today's consciousness of wide layers of the working class, and unalterably leading to one final conclusion, the conquest of power by the proletariat," end quote. Trotsky noted that the social democratic parties had long had both, quote, maximum and, quote, minimum programs, but insisted that, quote, that between these, quote, no bridge existed, end quote. He then went on to say that, quote, "the Fourth International does not discard the program of the old, quote, minimal demands to the degree to which these have preserved at least part of their vital forcefulness, but it carries on this day-to-day work within the framework of the correct actual, that is, revolutionary perspective. Insofar as the old, partial, quote, minimal, end quote, demands of the masses clash with the destructive and degrading tendencies of decadent capitalism, and this occurs at each step, the Fourth International advances a system of transitional demands, the essence of which is contained in the fact that ever more openly and decisively they will be directed against the very bases of the bourgeois regime," end quote. The first two transitional demands suggested by the document were those for, quote, employment and decent living conditions for all, end quote. These are to be achieved by further specific demands for sliding wage scales tied to price increases and a, quote, sliding scale of working hours, end quote, to spread the available work and assure full employment of all, but without any reduction in wages. Trotsky commented that, quote, "by means of this struggle, no matter what its immediate practical successes may be, the workers will best come to understand the necessity of liquidating capitalist slavery, end quote. Trotsky declared that the members of the Fourth International would continue to work in all mass organizations, particularly the existing unions, quote, for the purpose of strengthening them and raising their spirit of militancy, end quote. He soundly denounced, quote, sectarian attempts to build or preserve small, quote, revolutionary, end quote, unions as a second edition of the party, end quote, and declared that, quote, self-isolation of the capitulationist variety from mass trade unions, which is tantamount to betrayal of the revolution, is incompatible with membership in the Fourth International, end quote. However, not only did Trotsky's document declare that the unions, quote, cannot replace the party, end quote, but that, quote, as organizations expressive of the top layers of the proletariat, trade unions developed powerful tendencies towards compromise with the bourgeois democratic regime, end quote. As a consequence, quote, the sections of the Fourth International should always strive not only to renew the top leadership of the trade unions boldly and resolutely in critical moments, advancing new militant leaders in place of routine functionaries and careerists, but also to create in all possible instances independent militant organizations corresponding more closely to the task of mass struggle against bourgeois society, end quote. The first such organization which Trotsky proposed was the, quote, factory committee, end quote. It would be, quote, elected by all the factory employees, end quote, and would immediately establish, quote, a counterweight to the will of the administration, end quote. He observed that, quote, from the moment that the committee makes its appearance, a factual dual power is established in the factory. By its very essence, it represents the transitional state, because it includes in itself two irreconcilable regimes, the capitalist and the proletarian. The fundamental significance of factory committees is precisely contained in the fact that they open the doors, if not to direct revolutionary, then to a pre-revolutionary period between the bourgeois and the proletarian regimes, end quote. Trotsky's document emphasized that one of the purposes of the factory committee should be to end, quote, business secrets, end quote, and to insist on being told all of the financial details of the management of their respective enterprises. He explained that, quote, the immediate tasks of workers' control should be to explain the debits and credits of society, beginning with individual business undertakings to determine the actual share of the national income appropriated by individual capitalists and by the exploiters as a whole, end quote. The, quote, transitional, end quote, nature of the factory committees was emphasized by Trotsky. He said that, quote, the working out of even the most elementary economic plan from the point of view of the exploited, not the exploiters, is impossible without workers' control, that is, without the penetration of the worker's eye into all open and concealed springs of capitalist economy. Committees representing individual business enterprises should meet at conferences to choose corresponding committees of trust, whole branches of industry, economic regions, and finally of national industry as a whole. Thus, workers' control becomes a school for planned economy, end quote. He added that, quote, if the abolition of business secrets be a necessary condition to workers' control, then control is the first step along the road to the socialist guidance of economy, end quote. At the same time, that factory committees were seeking to develop workers' control, Trotsky asserted that, quote, the socialist program of expropriation, i.e., of political overthrow of the bourgeoisie and liquidation of its economic domination, should in no case during the present transitional period hinder us from advancing, when the occasion warrants, the demand for the expropriation of several key branches of industry vital for national existence, or of the most parasitic group of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Most particularly, the nationalization of the banking system must be sought because, quote, only the expropriation of the private banks and the concentration of the entire credit system in the hands of the state will provide the state with the necessary actual, i.e. material resources, and not merely paper and bureaucratic resources for economic planning, end quote. Trotsky was apparently very impressed with the revolutionary potential of the sit-down strikes which had occurred in France in 1936 and in the United States a year later. He commented that, quote, sit-down strikes are a serious warning from the masses addressed not only to the bourgeoisie, but also to the organizations of the workers, including the Fourth International. The present crisis can sharpen the class struggle to an extreme point and bring nearer the moment of denouement. But that does not mean that a revolutionary situation comes on at one stroke. Actually, its approach is signaled by a continuous series of convulsions. One of these is the wave of sit-down strikes, end quote. He tied in another transitional demand to the sit-down strike situation, arguing that the employers are, quote, nowhere satisfied with official police and army, end quote, and so established their own private armed groups. Therefore, quote, in connection with every strike and street demonstration, it is imperative to propagate the necessity for creating workers' groups of self-defense. It is necessary to write this slogan into the program of the revolutionary wing of the trade unions. It is imperative, wherever possible, beginning with the youth groups, to organize groups for self-defense, to drill and acquaint them with the use of arms, end quote. One second. Quote, workers and farmers government, end quote. There were several elements in the transitional program which became subjects of controversy among Trotsky's followers during the nearly half-century following the adoption of that program by the founding conference of the Fourth International. One of these was the, quote, workers and farmers government, end quote, formula presented in the document. Trotsky was anxious in the transitional program to differentiate between the way he and his followers might use the term and the way in which the Stalinists were presenting it. Trotsky noted that it was first used by the Bolsheviks in 1917, but then, quote, it represented nothing more than the popular designation for the already established dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Trotsky argued that the, quote, slogan, workers and farmers government, is thus acceptable to us only in the sense that it had in 1917 with the Bolsheviks, i.e. as an anti-bourgeois and anti-capitalist slogan, but in no case in the, quote, democratic, end quote, sense, which later the epigons gave it, transforming it from a bridge to the socialist revolution into the chief barrier upon its path, end quote. At various times in the future, this interpretation of the, quote, workers and farmers government, end quote, was to become an issue of dispute among Trotsky's followers. One faction or another within the movement accused its rivals of regarding the slogan as an intermediary concept different from the dictatorship of the proletariat rather than synonymous with it. Another aspect of this part of the transitional program also became a matter of controversy in the Trotskyist ranks after World War II. Trotsky posed the question of whether, quote, the traditional workers' organizations, end quote, could possibly bring into existence the kind of, quote, workers and peasants government, end quote, which the Trotskyists advocated. Trotsky thought it unlikely, but said that, quote, one cannot categorically deny and advance the theoretical possibility under the influence of completely exceptional circumstances. The petty bourgeois parties, including the Stalinists, may go further than they themselves wish along the road to a break with the bourgeoisie, end quote. In the 1950s, Michel Pablo, then the head of the International Secretariat of the Fourth International, was to argue that the Stalinist parties then in power in various countries were being forced to, quote, go further than they themselves, end quote, had wished to go, quote, along the road to a break with the bourgeoisie, end quote. On the basis of this analysis, he developed policies which split the Fourth International. The protagonists of the Castro regime within the ranks of international Trotskyism made a somewhat similar analysis in defending the evolution of a, quote, workers' state, end quote, in Cuba. However, in 1938, Trotsky argued that as the revolutionary situation developed, the factory committees and other spontaneous organizations established by the workers, quote, will soon begin to feel their lack of cohesion and their insufficiency. Not any of the traditional demands can be fully met under the conditions of preserving the bourgeois regime, end quote. The upshot of this would be the formation of Soviets. Trotsky argued that, quote, Soviets can arise only at the time when the mass movement enters into an openly revolutionary stage, end quote. They would, quote, unite the representatives of all the fighting groups. They throw open their doors to all the exploited. Through these doors pass representatives of all strata drawn into the general current of the struggle. All political currents of the proletariat can struggle for leadership of the Soviets on the basis of the widest democracy. The slogan of Soviets, therefore, crowns the program of transitional demands, end quote. Backward countries and combined development. Another element of the transitional program, which was to be used by the Trotskyists to differentiate themselves from the Stalinists and sometimes became a subject of controversy within the Trotskyist ranks, was its discussion of the situation in, quote, colonial and semi-colonial, end quote, countries. These countries, Trotsky proclaimed, quote, are backward by their very essence, end quote, but, quote, are part of a world dominated by imperialism, end quote. As a result, quote, their development, therefore, has a combined character. The most primitive economic forms are combined with the last word in capitalist technique and culture, end quote. As a consequence, quote, the struggle for the most elementary achievements of national independence and bourgeois democracy is combined with the socialist struggle against world imperialism. Democratic slogans, transitional demands, and the problems of the socialist revolution are not divided into separate historical epochs in this struggle, but stem directly from one another, end quote. Trotsky argued that the, quote, central rank tasks in those countries were the agrarian revolution and national independence. Quote, both tasks are closely linked, end quote. To illustrate his argument, Trotsky said that it was appropriate in those countries for the revolutionaries to put forward the, quote, slogan for a national or constituent assembly, end quote. Under this slogan, the workers could mobilize the support of the peasantry, but, quote, then, at a certain stage in the mobilization of the masses under the slogans of revolutionary democracy, Soviets can and should arise. Their historical role in each given period, particularly their relation to the National Assembly, will be determined by the political level of the proletariat, the bond between them and the peasantry, and the character of the proletarian party policies. Sooner or later, the Soviets should overthrow bourgeois democracy. Only they are capable of bringing the democratic revolution to a conclusion, and likewise opening up an era of socialist revolution, end quote. Quote, the struggle against imperialism and war, end quote. Considerable attention was turned in the transitional program to the threat of war and the way in which the Fourth International should confront war. After condemning both the, quote, collective security, end quote, ideas and the pacifism popular in different circles of the time, the program listed a number of specific positions Fourth Internationalists should advocate. These include complete opposition to expenditures on armaments, complete abolition of secret diplomacy, end quote. Quote, military training and arming of workers and farmers under direct control of workers and farmers committees, end quote, and various others. The program then put forward the basic position of the Fourth International with regard to the coming war. Quote, the imperialist bourgeoisie dominates the world. In its basic character, the approaching war will therefore be an imperialist war. The fundamental content of the politics of the international proletariat will consequently be a struggle against imperialism and its war. In this struggle, the basic principle is, quote, the chief enemy is your own country, end quote, or, quote, the defeat of your own imperialist government is the lesser evil, end quote. However, since all regimes were not imperialist, the military struggle of the colonial and semi-colonial countries, quote, will be not imperialist but liberating. It would be the duty of the international proletariat and the oppressed country to aid the oppressed countries in their war against the oppressors. The same duty applies in regard to aiding the USSR or whatever other workers' government might arise before the war or during the war, end quote. The program insisted, however, that, quote, the workers of imperialist countries cannot help an anti-imperialist country through their own government, no matter what might be the diplomatic and military relations between the two countries at a given moment, end quote. Even if a particular imperialist regime was temporarily an ally of an anti-imperialist regime, the proletariat of the imperialist country, quote, continues to remain in class opposition to its own government and supports the non-imperialist, quote, ally, end quote, through its own methods, i.e. through the methods of the international class struggle, end quote. Furthermore, quote, in supporting the colonial country or the USSR in a war, the proletariat does not in the slightest degree solidarize either with the bourgeois government of the colonial country or with the Thermidorian bureaucracy of the USSR, end quote. This position was to give rise to considerable confusion in the Trotskyist ranks during World War II. In France and Belgium in particular, after those countries were overrun by the Nazis, there was a tendency on the part of some Trotskyists to equate their countries with the, quote, semi-colonial, end quote, group worthy of the workers' support against Nazi imperialism. Even in the United States and Great Britain, the Trotskyists sometimes found it difficult to combine support for the Soviet Union and opposition to the war being waged in alliance with the Soviet Union. The Russian question. The section of the transition program dealing with the Soviet Union generally adopted what had by then become the traditional Trotskyist position. It stated that, quote, the USSR embodies terrific contradictions, but it still remains a degenerated worker state, such as the social diagnosis. The political prognosis has an alternative character. Either the bureaucracy, becoming ever more the organ of the world bourgeoisie in the workers' state, will overthrow the new forms of property and plunge the country back into capitalism, or the working class will crush the bureaucracy and open the way to socialism, end quote. Considerable attention was devoted to the Moscow trials, which the program said, quote, came not as a surprise and not as a result of the personal madness of the Kremlin dictator, but as the legitimate offspring of the Thermidor. They grew out of the unbearable conflicts within the Soviet bureaucracy itself, end quote. The transitional program gave a broad view of the nature of the, quote, political revolutions, the, quote, political revolution, end quote, which the Fourth International sought in the Soviet Union. It postulated that, quote, a fresh upsurge of the revolution in the USSR will undoubtedly begin under the banner of the struggle against social inequality and political oppression. The struggle for the freedom of the trade unions and the factory committees and for the right of assembly and freedom of the press will unfold in the struggle for the regeneration and development of Soviet democracy, end quote. Specifically, the transitional program proclaimed that, quote, as once the bourgeoisie and kulaks were not permitted to enter the Soviets, so now it is necessary to drive the bureaucracy and the new aristocracy out of the Soviets. In the Soviets, there is room only for representatives of the workers, rank and file, collective farmers, peasants, and Red Army men, end quote. Becoming more specific than most previous Fourth International documents on how the proposed democratization was to be assured, the transitional program proclaimed that, quote, democratization of the Soviets is impossible without legalization of Soviet parties. The workers and peasants themselves, by their own free vote, will indicate what parties they recognize as Soviet parties, end quote. Finally, the section of the program dealing with the USSR called for recognition of the planned economy, quote, in the interest of the producers and consumers, end quote, and of the collective farms, quote, in the interest of the workers there engaged, end quote. I think there's a typo here in this little subtitle. Peroration is what it says. But maybe that's something that I don't know what the hell that is. I don't know. I guess, what the fuck is a peroration? Let's look that up. I don't know what that means. Peroration, the concluding part of a speech typically intended to inspire enthusiasm in the audience. Alright. Learn a new word today. The transitional program adopted by the founding conference of the Fourth International on September 3rd, 1938 ended with a peroration about the International itself. In its conclusion, this section of the document returned to the theme with which it began, quote, the present crisis in human culture is the crisis in the proletarian leadership. The advanced workers united in the Fourth International show their class the way out of the crisis. They offer a program based on international experience and the struggle of the proletariat and of all the oppressed of the world for liberation. They offer a spotless banner. Workers, men, and women of all countries, place yourselves under the banner of the Fourth International. It is the banner of your approaching victory, end quote. The GPU and the Fourth International in the 1930s. Before proceeding with the discussion of the further history of the Fourth International, it is necessary to relate and comment upon the efforts of the Soviet secret police, then known as the GPU, to penetrate the highest circles of the movement. This subject became a matter of great controversy within the movement many years later, when much of what was discussed was quite aside from the point. However, there did lie behind this controversy a certain amount of reality. It is clear to start with that Stalin was very much preoccupied with the persistence of Trotsky as the principal alternative to himself as leader of the Russian Revolution, and was perhaps unduly impressed with the potentialities of the movement which Trotsky was trying to build. The numerous murders of Trotskyist leaders during the late 1930s culminated in the assassination of Trotsky on August 1940, and is proof enough of this fact. Under those circumstances, it is understandable that Stalin was anxious to penetrate the movement led by Stalin to the greatest degree possible. Stalin was anxious to penetrate the movement led by Trotsky to the greatest degree possible. He was particularly anxious to know what was going on in the highest circles of the movement and perhaps to influence the attitudes and activities of the International Secretariat and the International Executive Committee of what after September 3rd, 1938 was officially the Fourth International. At various times, there were at least 4 people who were associated with the top leadership of the International Trotskyist movement who were certainly or almost certainly GPU agents at the same time. These were Pavel Okin, O-K-I-N, also known as M. Mill, and Jacques Aubin. Abraham and Reuven Sobolevicius, known in Trotskyist circles as Abraham Senin and Roman Well, and Mark Zborovsky, who was known within the Trotskyist movement as Etienne. All of these men were Russian-speaking, which was the basis of their gaining the confidence of Trotsky and his son, Leon Sadov. Jean van Heijenoort has written about the first of these, that, quote, Paul Okun, also known as Oben, was a Jew from the southern Ukraine living as a refugee in Brussels, who had displayed Trotskyist sympathies. Though he did not go to live in Principo, he was soon immediately involved with the work of the International Secretariat. Raymond Molinier arranged for him to come to Paris at the beginning of the December 1930. He took the name of Mill, although Aubin did not settle in Principe as a secretary to Trotsky. Raymond Molinier took him there for a visit of several weeks. I heard that Trotsky was fond of exchanging childhood memories in Russian with Mill. Toward the middle of 1932, Aubin entered into negotiations with the Soviet embassy in Paris to return to Russia. He received permission to go back and live in Kharkov, where he had relatives. Who was he, turncoat or spy? Unquote. Isaac Deutscher, who mistakenly identified Mill as a, quote, American, seemed less doubtful than Jean van Heijenoort about the man's real identity. He commented that, quote, Mill was presently exposed as a Stalinist, end quote. George Ferriken was also convinced that while associated with the International Secretariat, Mill was already a Stalinist agent. He insisted that Mill contributed substantially to the widening the split between Trotsky and Alfred Rosmer, which culminated in late in 1930 with Rosmer's leaving the Trotskyist movement. Even though it seems like Rosmer, you just said earlier that Rosmer and Trotsky remained friends to the effect that they allowed the establishment of the Fourth International to take place at his house outside of Paris. But I don't know what that means, but just from a callback to earlier part of the essay. Ferriken commented that in this, quote, he played the role which was indicated by his masters of the Soviet bureaucracy, end quote. Jean van Heijenoort had no doubts about the GPU affiliation of the Sobolevikius brothers. Of them, he says, quote, Abraham and Reuven Sobolevikius were Lithuanian Jews who, under the names of Abraham Senin and Roman Well, appeared on the scene as members of the German Trotskyite group in Leipzig in 1929. As is now known, they were then agents of the GPU recruited and trained in 1927. The Sobolevikius brothers rose rapidly in the international organization. Well undertook responsibility for the circulation of the Bulletin of the Opposition in Germany. Leon Sadov, Lyova, soon came to rely on Well for the circulation of the journal in Russia itself and in the bordering countries, which was far more serious. The two brothers participated in the leadership of the German Trotskyist group and in the work of the International Secretariat, end quote. Van Heijenoort argued that the Sobolevikius brothers, like Mill, tried through intense factional activity to weaken both the German and international Trotskyist organizations. With regard to the German movement, he said that, quote, many reasons can be cited, end quote, for the weakness of the group. Quote, but it may well be that the deceitful intrigues of the Sobolevikius brothers were an important factor, end quote. Trotsky apparently did not suspect the GPU connections of the Sobolevikius brothers. Isaac Deutscher noted that after the defection of Mill from the International Secretariat, quote, Trotsky then sought to overhaul it with the help of Senin Sobolevikius and Well, end quote. Later, Deutscher noted that an open break between them and Trotsky occurred in December 1932 when Senin, quote, moved a motion dissociating the International Secretariat of the Opposition from one of Trotsky's sharp attacks on Stalin, end quote. Deutscher said that, quote, even now Trotsky suspected no foul play, but thought that Lenin was yielding to the, quote, party's pull, end quote, and that this might lead him to capitulation. He evidently regretted losing an intelligent and helpful follower, but the break was accomplished, and soon Lenin disappeared from Trotsky's horizon, end quote. Only after the first Moscow trial, according to Van Heijenoort, did Trotsky come to suspect that, quote, the brothers Well and Lenin, end quote, might have been GPU spies in the Trotskyist ranks. The identity of the Sobolevikius brothers became clear in the 1950s. Roman Well, by then known as Robert Soblin, was involved in the Rosenberg atomic espionage case in 1950 and received a 30-year jail sentence, of which he served 18 years. His brother Abraham, by then going under the name of Jack Soblin, was then arrested in the United States in 1957 and received a 7-year jail sentence as a Soviet espionage agent. The case of Mark Zborovsky was, however, the most serious of all. After the rise of Hitler to power, Leon Sedov moved from Berlin to Paris and was for the next 5 years the most important figure in the International Secretariat. During most of that time, Zborovsky was his closest associate and continued after Sedov's death to be a key figure in the International Secretariat. Jean van Heijenoort has said that, quote, Zborovsky had found his way to Lyova through the French Trotskyist group. He had joined the group after presenting himself as a student with sympathies for Trotskyism. When Jeannie learned that he knew Russian, she introduced him to Lyova. Zborovsky's modus operandi was much different from that of the Sobolevikius brothers, who played the role of leaders in the German section and in the International Secretariat. Van Heijenoort observed that, quote, my definite impression is that Zborovsky never asked Lyova a question that could provoke a political discussion of any sort or lead even to a serious conversation on a serious topic. He was obliging, always willing to fulfill the tasks with which Lyova entrusted him. There was nothing you could grapple with in him except his insignificance, end quote. An American acquaintance of Zborovsky, Etienne, had somewhat the same impression of his relationship with Leon Sedov. Albert Glotzer met him in 1934 in Sedov's office in the International Secretariat in Paris. He recalled that during several meetings with Sedov, Etienne was always present, but since he spoke only French and Russian, and Glotzer spoke neither, the two men never conversed. Nonetheless, at each meeting, Zborovsky was able to overhear the conversation. Glotzer was told at the time that Zborovsky was a member of the French section, edited the Russian bulletin, and was a close friend of Sedov. Zborovsky was thought to be implicated in the deaths of several of the Trotskyist leaders who died at the hands of the GPU. Jean van Heijenoort noted that with regard to Leon Sedov's fatal decision when he fell ill to go to a Russian clinic, quote, which in Paris in 1938 could only have been staffed with white Russians and Stalinist agents, end quote, that, quote, Zborovsky could hardly have failed to strengthen him in this decision, end quote. Van Heijenoort noted that Zborovsky's Zborowski, quote, is today known to have been a Stalinist spy, end quote. Isaac Deutscher suggested the possibility that Zborowski was also associated with the murder of Rudolf Clement. Speculating on the reasons for the GPUs deciding to get rid of Clement, Deutscher asked, quote, had he recently come into possession of some important GPU secret? Had he been on the track of their agent provocateur, perhaps about to unmask him? End quote. Here and elsewhere, Deutscher used the phrase agent provocateur to refer to Zborowski. In retrospect, an American who was one of the last people to see Clement alive also suspected that Zborowski was probably the person who got rid of him. Emmanuel Geltman, then in Paris in connection with preparatory work for the founding conference, attended a meeting at which Zborowski and Clement were both present. Geltman walked some distance with these two after the meeting broke up, and finally Zborowski and Clement went off together. Geltman noted that Clement was never seen alive again, and that his body was found gruesomely butchered in the Seine several days later. Geltman, or is it the Seine? I can't remember. I think it's the Seine. The river in Paris. You know what the fuck I'm talking about. Geltman was also convinced that Zborowski arranged for the murder of Ignaz Reiss, the GPU agent who defected to the Trotskyists. George Thurikin had the same suspicion. Zborowski survived to migrate to the United States, where he gained some fame as an anthropologist. In September 1955, former GPU General Alexander Orlov testified before the International Security Subcommittee of the United States Senate concerning Zborowski's having been a GPU agent, noting that he had been considered of sufficient importance for the GPU to keep Stalin personally informed of his activities. 5 months later, Zborowski himself testified before the same Senate committee. He admitted that he had been a GPU agent during the period of his association with Leon Sedov and the International Secretariat, although he sought to downplay the importance of his role. Neither the senators on the committee nor Robert Morris, their counsel, had sufficient interest in international Trotskyism, apparently, to push Zborowski very hard on the subject. After his denunciation by Orlov, Zborowski sought out 3 old Paris acquaintances then living in the United States, David and Lola Dallin and Elsa Reiss, the widow of the GPU agent Ignaz Reiss, who had defected to the Trotskyists and then been murdered by his ex-comrades of the Soviet secret police. Zborowski sought to, quote, explain his actions as a GPU agent. He submitted himself to an extensive interrogation by the 3 former Paris acquaintances, on which David Dallin took extensive notes. Both in his Senate testimony and his discussion with the Dallins and Mrs. Reiss, Zborowski specifically claimed, quote, not to remember, end quote, having given the GPU information about 3 people with the deaths of whom his Trotskyist former friends suspected that he was involved, and who certainly died at the hands of the GPU. These were the cases of Rudolf Clement, Erwin Wolf, and Walter Held. He also professed to have had nothing to do with the selection of the White Russian clinic where Leon Sedov died under mysterious circumstances after an appendicitis operation, nor, he claimed, did he inform the GPU of Sedov's whereabouts. By the time that the founding conference of the Fourth International met, Zborowski was already suspected by some of those associated with him of being a GPU agent. Hendrik Snevleit, I need to fucking look that up again. Oh, my computer locked up.
Sneeuwvliet. Sneeuwvliet.
Sneeuwvliet. Sneeuwvliet, who publicly accused him, a fact which Zborowski duly reported to Trotsky. About this same time, Trotsky had received direct, although anonymous, evidence of the fact that Zborowski was a GPU agent. Alexander Orlov, who had been chief GPU agent in Spain and defected to the United States, reaching there in August 1938, wrote Trotsky a letter from Philadelphia dated September 27, 1938, warning him about Zborowski. However, Orlov did not identify himself in the letter. Perhaps because of the anonymous nature of the information he received, Trotsky appears to have taken no action on the basis of it. Yet the identification of Zborowski could hardly have been clearer. Orlov wrote that, quote, "This agent provocateur has for a long time been the collaborator of your son Leon Sadov," end quote. Orlov said that he was not sure of the last name of the man involved, but that his first name was Mark. Orlov went on, quote, "He was literally the shadow of Sadov. He informed the Cheka of every step of Sadov, even his personal activities and correspondence, which the provocateur reads with his approval. The provocateur has won the total confidence of your son, and he knows through him all about the activities of your organization. Thanks to him, many Chekists have been decorated. This provocateur worked until 1938 in the archives of the Institute of the well-known Bolshevik Nikolaevsky in Paris, and perhaps still works there. It is this Mark who stole a part of your archives from the apartment of Nikolaevsky. These documents have been transferred to Moscow. This agent provocateur is between 32 and 35 years of age. He is a Jew born in the Russian part of Poland, writes Russian well. He wears glasses, he is married, and he has a baby," end quote. Apparently, the suspicions about Zborowski were sufficiently great that his Trotskyist associates did not want to continue him in his role of the leadership of the Fourth International. According to Rudolf Prager, Zborowski was brought to the founding conference at the last minute and attended its sessions. However, when he suggested that he ought to be a member of the International Executive Committee elected at the September 3, 1938 meeting as a representative of the Russian section, his suggestion was rejected. If Mark Zborowski and the GPU had the objective of preventing the formal establishment of a Trotskyist Fourth International, they certainly did not succeed in doing so. However, they almost certainly did contribute to making it a less potent and extensive organization than it might otherwise have been.